Welcome to the Sister Citizen Talks. This is a series of productions of the Anna Julia Cooper Center with generous support from the Miss Foundation for Women and a partnership with multiple units at Wake Forest University. Your host this series is Melissa Harris Perry. She is the founder and president of the Anna Julia Cooper Center and the Maya Angelou Presidential Chair at Wake Forest University.
Zach Bynum, who is part of the community of the Anna Julia Cooper Center, as well as the community of Wake Forest University, which is, I think, in part why he gave you that Wake Forest University excitement. It is homecoming weekend. We are here at the Anna Julia Cooper Center, an independent organization, and our mission is to advance justice through intersectional scholarship and action. And we're really thrilled that you have joined us. This is the second event in our series, Sister Citizens, Conversations with Black Women in U.S. Politics and Media. And this semester, in my role as the Maya Angelou Presidential Chair here at Wake Forest, I'm teaching a course titled Black Women in U.S. Politics and Media. And so this speaker series is kind of the public-facing aspect of the class, and all the discussions that we're going to be having in this series are designed to support various aspects of the course. So, for example, this evening, before coming here, we had a really lovely discussion about strategies for Black women candidates running for office. We were led by a graduate student in our course who led us through some possibilities of possible candidates running at different levels. And we thought a lot about sort of what those strategies would look like, which is part of what makes it so exciting to talk with the person that I will be talking with tonight, because no better person to be the public-facing aspect of that. Now, I do want to point out that if you missed our very first event, you can go over to the Anna Julia Cooper Center's YouTube channel or to our Facebook page, and you will find our conversation with Stephanie Brown James of the Collective PAC and April O. Turner of Higher Heights for America. And we encourage, if you are watching tonight and you want to chat back with us, use the hashtag Sister Citizen Talks. Oh, and one more thing. Thanks to the Ms. Foundation, because without their financial support, this would not be possible. All right, so let me introduce to you my conversation partner who's going to be joining me this evening. I am truly honored to introduce my friend and colleague, Karen Finney. I have known Karen, I realize, as we chatted earlier today, for longer than either one of us should probably talk about. She is a remarkably warm, compassionate, funny, and humane human being. And I know that you all might not know all of that because you often probably see her sort of in the battle of political communications, where she's using the weapons of her keen intellect and her deep insight, her broad experience, and let's face it, her devastating snark. She is among the most dynamic and influential Black women in American politics. She's been a CNN contributor since 2019. She's got a very long resume. And of course, she and I did share some time together over at that other cable network for a while.
Yes.
Right now, it's also worth noting she serves as vice chair of NARAL's Pro-Choice America Board and is chair of the Ultraviolet Board. Karen Finney, thank you for being here today.
Melissa, it's so exciting to be with you and on such an important topic that we both love and care about so dearly.
And at a time when, like, who knew the world would be quite this intense at the time that we were doing this?
Just a little chaos.
A little chaos. I was like, I rewrote the question about the House Speaker battle like 3 times because it kept changing in the course of the day. But look, before we get started on all the politics, Karen, because I do know you and I feel like I want to start here, I want to talk about your own personal health a little bit, because you have been really forthright, courageous, honest. You've shared in the public about having had brain surgery for a very serious condition. You wrote just a few weeks after the surgery that part of what you wanted to do was to remain on the airwaves and allow your viewing audience to actually come along on your healing journey with you. So how are you feeling and where are you in that journey now?
I feel great. I feel incredibly blessed. It's the kind of experience that takes some time, sort of before the surgery. I was so focused on being in the best emotional, physical space that I could be, and determined that I would survive the surgery, of course. And then, there were for those who haven't read it, again, I had some complications with my surgery. My left vocal cord is paralyzed, and I'm so grateful and blessed because my right vocal cord just figured out how to, as my doctor said, figured it out basically. And my voice has healed. I would say it's about 80% of where it was before, but you know, and I'll just say, I thought it was important to show, and obviously in that piece you showed, my voice was much softer and it was still pretty new. I think so often when we hear stories, we end up, there's the beginning, there's the drama, and then the triumph. And
Mhm.
we know that life is really lived in those spaces where we are struggling. And I thought it was important for people to see that, it's okay that I'm not perfect. It's okay that my voice is not the same as it was. It doesn't mean my brain isn't, functioning. And I'll tell you, the person who, just to touch into politics for a moment, Senator John Fetterman, I think, really demonstrated that to
Mhm.
us with his courageous run for the Senate. And I think it's so important that we are constantly making space for, we're showing up in different ways, and that's important. And all of our voices matter. So I'm doing great, and really blessed.
That said, Karen, I so appreciate you making the connection with Fetterman. But it is, I want to suggest, a different kind of politics to show up in public space as a Black woman imperfect, as
Oh
a
yeah.
Black woman in the context of an experience of disability, whether, even if it is not a permanent experience of disability, that the the requirements of Black women in politics do leave within this language or this assumptions about the necessity of perfection.
Absolutely. And, it's also in politics, showing any vulnerability is generally seen as weakness, even though we celebrate others when
Mhm.
they do it, right? It's sort of like, good for them, not for us. And, but again, I thought it was important. And I also thought as a Black woman, it was important because it is hard and we do struggle, and we have to show each other that, so that maybe somebody else can say, okay, it's all right that maybe I'm just not feeling up to it today. It doesn't even have to be about a specific health issue or concern.
Mhm.
And I'm lucky that I have, this is something I always say to young people, right? Having a circle of friends who support you and who are going to have your back and lift you up. And, I sort of knew that they would help make sure that if anybody tried to silence me or criticize, that they'd have my back. And I will say CNN was very supportive of my colleagues there, because I was concerned that they would say, well, her voice isn't quite right, I think we should
Right.
wait. And I was like, you
Mhm.
know what? And in the very beginning, I said, look, this may be what it is forever,
Right.
you know,
Right.
and that's okay too, you know.
Mhm.
So
Well, I'm happy to know that your colleagues were supportive, and
yeah.
I love your sort of lesson there about squad care, right? We can only do so much self-care. We need squad care. And I'm wondering, in part, because I want to, as we transition into the politics piece here,
Yeah.
I'm wondering about the ways that part of what you're talking about is modeling sort of ways of being in the public space as a woman. I want to listen to something that you actually said back in 2019. Now, this is in advance of the 2020 election cycle. And you
Okay.
were actually
Uh-oh.
addressing the right. You were addressing the National Partisan Partnership for Women and Families. But let's take a look and a listen.
Okay. Maybe.
Zach, do we have the video?
Or I can try to, I see that. I was going to say, if I knew what it was, I could try to
Yeah,
say it
that's
for you.
okay. No,
We
yeah,
could do a
that's all
live
right.
reenactment.
Yeah. So, all right. So you were talking about the necessity of electing more women.
Yes.
And he said that we have to make sure that we continue to make progress electing more women, because we know that having progressive women at the tables where decisions are made is essential to continuing to make progress, to protecting our healthcare, ending our maternal mortality crisis, defending our and securing our reproductive rights, and making our workplaces fair and more family friendly. So that was more than 4 years ago. How do you think we're doing?
Better. I do think better. And Ketanji Brown Jackson is evidence of that. The vice president is evidence of that. The fact that we have Black women running for the Senate is evidence of that, and more Black women than ever in the U.S. Congress and elected at all levels across the country. But we need to do much better. And, we were joking earlier about what's happening right now in Washington on the Hill. I am convinced that if women were in charge, we would have a speaker. This foolishness would not have gone on this long. And I want to mention that. I know we're going to talk about Black women, obviously, but one of the things that's so interesting is, Nancy Pelosi as a leader was, she also had a very thin margin, but she did her work. She didn't just show up on the day of the vote in January and assume by the force of her will she was going to make it happen. She met with the people who were opposing her. She heard their concerns. She figured it out. That is a hallmark of women's leadership. We are good listeners, right? And versus the strategy that McCarthy and just recently Jim Jordan thought, we're going to get to the floor and I'm just going to figure it out, and and obviously that did not work. And so I think it's just an instructive moment as well, because I think women are collaborative leaders, and that's a big part of the experience we bring to the table. And as Black women, we bring a whole other wealth of experience, because we see and hear people and communities that a lot of times, if you're if you're a white man, you just might not, it's not in your experience. And that's part of why having our voices are so important at decision-making tables.
I mean, I'll say there's another model of leadership that we get from Nancy Pelosi in the context of her decision to also step down as speaker while remaining a presence in the House. I mean, that is that's like leadership 101 that almost no leaders manage to actually do, where you can go ahead and sort of make space for the next leader without having to disappear. I mean, it's actually extraordinary. I'm not sure that I can name another time that we've seen that.
I think you're exactly right. And also, she very intentionally had been ensuring that younger members of the caucus, and particularly the three who, Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries and the other two in leadership, that they were getting the experiences they needed to be ready, to be prepared. I don't think anybody was prepared for what we saw in January, but from a leadership perspective, and the other thing that she has done, she also, because fundraising is, as we know in politics, it is critically important. She also did a lot to ensure that Hakeem Jeffries would be successful in fundraising, and tried to, really made clear to donors that was going to be critical to support him. And I want to mention that because particularly for Black candidates and Black women in particular, we have a much harder time raising money. When I worked for Stacey Abrams, when she was running for governor the first time, and I'm sure she did the second time, she had a deck that was almost like a pitch to donors about why to invest, in the way you might see a marketing pitch, right? About why she was a good investment for governor of Georgia as a candidate. And it's always shocking to me how much harder it is for women, and particularly Black women, to raise the dollars they need to be competitive.
So I have a student question on something very similar. So Zach, let me ask this time if we have the video from from my student Remy available. If we do, then we'll play that question for you.
Hi, my name is Remy, and I'm a sophomore at Wake Forest University. My question for Karen is that you have the very unique perspective as someone who's worked on numerous presidential campaigns. You've hosted your own show on MSNBC, and you've held various roles in organizations such as the Democratic National Committee. And throughout your time holding these positions, do you feel like the support for Black women candidates has shifted or has been boosted? And where can this change be seen?
Great question. I do, and I think part of it is there's a couple of ways. Number one, obviously, Black folks did what we do. We created outside. You had Stephanie Brown James on. We've created, Higher Heights. We created organizations specifically geared towards increasing the number of Black folks, Black women in particular, and in the case of Higher Heights, pro-choice Black women to elective office. And so, which is critically important that we have these outside sources, because sometimes these are the places where you may see a candidate who is not necessarily the choice of what we would call, the establishment. Sometimes these sources are the way people get off the ground and get to the point where they get noticed and then, get larger support. So those organizations are really critical. We also have organizations like Emily's List, which supports women. And I do think within the party, there has been a shift. I mean, I worked for a time for Sherry Beasley's campaign. She ran for senator for North Carolina. Obviously, unfortunately, her campaign fell short. But, there was in the early phases, there was a real understanding, even though it was a contested primary, that she was likely going to be the nominee, and a lot of support towards her and understanding of that. And it's interesting, Melissa, the other thing I want to point out is one of the advantages that as Black women we have is, there was a time when it was, well, we're not in those back rooms and we don't always have those kind of connections. And that's true. And that's still something we have to build those relationships in other ways. At the same time, from the perspective of the public, they see us as less a part of Washington, less a part of the system, right? And in a moment when Americans are increasingly frustrated and suspicious of institutions, that's a real benefit for us. And to tie this back to the question, I actually think more people in the sort of structures of the party are recognizing that that's an advantage we bring to the table as candidates who can win, particularly in tough races where where those margins make such a difference.
I love that idea that, like, just in our identity, right? Just at that intersection of Blackness and womanhood, we signal outsider status in some important way, that could be beneficial in the context of sort of an electoral mood that is toward outsiderness. Now, that said, I want to, because you know me, we're going to go through some data. Let's look at some data. All right. So I do want to look at the last election. So this is the midterm 2022. Yeah. And I want to look at the numbers of Black women who were candidates versus who wins the nomination versus who wins the races. So let's just start with the U.S. House. And in the U.S. House, we're looking here at data from the Center for American Women in Politics. Big shout out to COP. Love them. They're at Rutgers. And you can see here, you've got 134 candidates who are across both Democrats and Republicans, right? Although the majority are Democrats. Of those 134, 56 end up actually winning the nomination, and 27 win the seat. And all 27 are Democrats. Now, some of that is just going to be incumbency and all kinds of other things. But I'm wondering, when you see those numbers, what that looks like to you. What do you see?
Yeah. So I see a couple of things. I see, number one, again, what we just talked about, for these women candidates, raising money is very hard. It's much harder. And we do practically have to explain why we are a good investment, why it's possible. That's getting better because, again, the more Black women we elect to different posts, the more people have a model for it in their head. They can see it. They can believe in the possibility. But so finance is key piece. Number two, we also know that Black women and candidates of color in general, and disabled Americans, LGBTQ plus Americans, are more likely to be targets of disinformation campaigns. So for Black women candidates, there's also, and it's hard to be running your campaign, you're trying to get your message out, and you're having to, earlier sometimes than other candidates. and you're dealing and online. I mean, and God only knows with AI now, it's going to be a whole new world in 2024. The kinds of things we're going to see in terms of disinformation and misinformation. It also suggests to me that probably some of these women, they didn't have institutional backing or support. So it's just a tougher road because you've got to get endorsements. Part of the reason you want to get endorsements is that those endorsements, like labor, that's actually bodies on the ground, people knocking on doors, people, right? And so it's not just money.
SEIU doesn't just come with money. SEIU comes with purple shirts, right?
That's
on the
right.
ground.
That's right. AFT knocking on those doors, right? And so, so as you're going through your campaign, right, that's the other challenge. And look, let's be honest, Black women still face, a lot. I wanted to start on a positive thing that we bring to the table, because we tend to focus so much because there are challenges. I wanted us to be aware that, hey, there's a benefit too, but also just being heard and, getting our voices out there, getting our message out and being taken seriously as women. We see things like candidates, the way they're maybe portrayed either in a story online or what have you, pictures of the women tend to be more childish or less professional than the men. So as women, we have to be mindful of a whole different set of things around being taken seriously, being seen as credible, being seen as someone who can handle the job. And that, it's everything from what you say to how you say it to how you look. It's a lot of, frankly, Melissa, there's some of the same things we dealt with when we're on television.
Listen.
So I know. But so that's when I see those numbers, that's what I see. At the same time, I do want to highlight, I love seeing the number of women who got out there and ran.
That's right. Yeah. Without a candidate, you can't win. Yeah. Yeah.
And one thing we're seeing, I'll just highlight, is more women actually also running for state legislature. Now, in part, it's because they're part-time jobs. They don't make a lot of money. There are people who, but we're seeing a lot of progress with women running for state legislature. And part of why does that matter? Because that is a good platform from which to then run for the House or run for the Senate. And that's the other thing we have to always be thinking about is, what is that pipeline? And that data that you showed, the other thing is, I hope, that those 27 women that are running for re-election, but the women who ran will consider running again. Because the other thing we know from the data, and Center for America, CAP knows this as well, once we run and lose, there's not as much of an infrastructure that says, okay, we're going to look out for you and help you get ready to run again.
That's right.
But with men, people come in and they say, okay, we're going to get you this job and you're going to work at the law firm, and then we're going to raise money and you're going to run. So that's the other thing I think when we look at that data, I want us to be seeing.
Yeah, I love that point that a first loss doesn't have to be a totalizing loss, but you do need some structures in place. All right, now I want to run through a little bit on the Senate here. I'm going to show a couple different things. So first, I want to look at those same sort of numbers, but from the Senate side this time. And obviously, running for Senate is a more expensive and rarer endeavor for all candidates. But if we look at those numbers from 2022, right, we can see, again, these are Center for American Women in Politics numbers. And you'll see that there are 22 Black women who run for the U.S. Senate. Of those, only 4 women win nomination. All are Democrats. And of course, none wins a seat, right? So until a few weeks ago, right, we had no woman in no Black woman in the U.S. Senate. But then if we have the image, Zach, of our current African-American U.S. Senator, LaFonza Butler, from California, being sworn in at the Congressional Black Caucus. And you'll see there's the statue of Rosa Parks behind her. And of course, smiling there next to her is an actual candidate for this same seat. This is Representative Barbara Lee. So I have to ask you about this decision, because on the one hand, Governor Newsom puts an African-American woman in this seat, and in fact, a queer woman and a woman with a long history of connection with labor, but he doesn't give the incumbency advantage to Barbara Lee, right? Which is something he could have done, right?
Yes.
Because then she'd have been running as an incumbent.
Yeah.
So give me your reaction to the decision.
Well, I would have handled it differently. The way, the
Really?
governor,
Would you govern differently than Gavin Newsom? I'm shocked, Aaron.
I'm gonna just put that out there. He did say, we should just take a quick step back to say that when President Biden and Vice President Harris won, there was a lot of pressure. I was part of that campaign effort to have him replace the now Vice President Harris with a Black woman. He chose Alex Padilla. Alex Padilla is a fantastic public servant. He's doing an incredible job in the Senate. But then the promise was, okay, if I have another chance to do this, I will appoint a Black woman.
Mm-hmm.
He did say, though, when Senator Feinstein passed away, he said very early on that he would not appoint anyone who was already in the race. And I understand. I mean, I think there was a lot of political pressure, around. And I have to say, I mean, I think the other two candidates, they're fantastic, again, public servants.
Sure.
But yeah, there was that frustration that it was done, and some of the way this was done, it could have been done in a way that was more helpful, put it that way, to Barbara Lee. Laphonza Butler happens to be a friend. She actually did announce today that she's not going to seek the seat. So I hope that helps Barbara Lee and her, because that was going to be, Black women were like, oh, which way are we going to go?
Yep.
So now we know we have a Black woman in that seat for the next 18 months, and we have the opportunity to have a Black woman in 2024. So yeah,
let me push just a little bit more than and ask this question.
Yeah.
Should, at the time, presidential candidate Joe Biden, now president of the United States, before he chose the only Black woman in the U.S. Senate as his running mate, should he have secured from the governor a commitment to replace her with a Black woman? Just, I mean, it's in some ways an odd choice to pick the senator from a state you're definitely going to win to be your vice presidential candidate, right? So this is not being angry at the Harris move at all, right? But if we're just thinking strategy, right, one might have chosen, for example, somebody who didn't already hold a position that was going to be vacated and was in a swing state, like say a Georgia, so like maybe a Stacey Abrams. I'm not saying it shouldn't be Stacey Abrams. I'm just saying maybe it should have been. But either way, like, should he, in making those deals, have secured that from the governor at the time back then?
It's a really interesting thought. I think obviously in that moment, I think they were so focused on, when you're in a campaign, you're just trying to keep body and soul together and get up the next day. But it's a really interesting point because, there could have been a conversation that was private so that it wouldn't have been publicly presumptuous, right? That could have said, hey, if we do win, that means there won't be a Black woman in the Senate. So sure, that could have been, that could have happened. I will just share with you, as you know, we're all just so happy he picked a Black woman. And, we did a lot of work around shifting the conversation from, because initially people said, a Black woman, I don't know, not sure America's ready. And there was a lot of intentional work done to shift that conversation to, well, how could he not appoint select a Black woman? Right. And that, I just kind of tying that back in, that's also really important because, again, I think despite how you feel about Kamala Harris, I don't want to get into, but it was important that one of the things we were seeing in the polling was Americans did say in battleground states, they did say, you know what, we think having that lived perspective at the table with Joe Biden is a good thing. And so those are the trends I want us to keep pushing on.
And I mean, Karen, you used the passive voice there. There was pressure, but you were actually, I mean, it wasn't just some folks, right? I mean, you were part of a group of people who had that conversation. Now, I want to go to another question from a
Mhm.
student. This question is coming from my student Colin, and he's in fact sort of again putting you right at the center of some of this important work. And
Yeah.
Zach, if we've got Colin's video, let's take a listen.
Hi, my name is Colin Kondwa. I'm a senior at Wake Forest, and my question is, were there any strategies during your time with the Stacey Abrams campaign that you felt like you and your team pioneered that have helped other Black women succeed in campaigning?
Great question. Dan, you got really great students with amazing questions. There were, I mean, and it's, and I need to write about it. Like so much of it is in here and but we did. So a couple of things, one of the things that we did with Stacey was, and we saw this tactic kind of used a little bit in the Warnock campaign, Raphael Warnock, who then ran for Senate. Um, uh, she is a Black woman. She is single. And, one of the things, people said, well, she doesn't have kids. And I said, well, you're still part of a family, right? Because we always want to humanize. And part of the way also that we were trying to get away from the angry Black woman stereotype was, let's show Stacey. I mean, she has nieces and nephews and right. And exactly. So we did a lot of, in our ads, we featured her a lot with children, and we did some ads. We showed her around the table, at Sunday dinner, kind of thing. One of the other things we understood that we needed to do is to make it clear that she had support from white elected officials. So some of the early events we did, we had some of her white colleagues. That's not to say the Black colleagues aren't important, but we wanted, but we wanted to show. So we, again, we were very just conscious of the visuals.
And I know that happened in the Sherry Beasley campaign too, and it was both across race but also across party. So there were white Republicans saying, "Hey, here's what I know about her as a judge." Right, that was really important.
That's right. Right. And it was interesting in Sherry's race. One of the things we learned was we really had to explain to people what her being a judge, we had to define what that meant because people had lots of different ideas. The other thing I'll point out with Stacey that I think was really important, and it kind of goes to where we started, was, typically in campaigns, we do oppo research. We know there are things out there and you kind of wait for it to hit. And we were having a conversation, Stacey, she is a tax attorney, but she is someone who did not pay her taxes for 2 years. That goes to the stereotype of Black folks not being good with money. And so there was a real...
I might know something about being in the news for not paying your taxes. Yes.
You may have heard this kind of saga. So, but I said, well, wait a second. And the assumption was, oh my God, how do we deal with this? And I said, well, hold up. Why? What was going on? And she said, well, my parents lost their house in Katrina. My brother Walter went to jail. They were taking care of his daughter. My dad got cancer. And I was like, okay, that's what we're going to talk about. Because that is what every American goes through.
Yep.
And we were able to shift that narrative by leaning into vulnerability. And I do think that was a little bit groundbreaking and something I would love to see politicians do more, not for the sake of trying to humanize yourself, but because it was real, it was sincere, it was, it was a way to demonstrate whether you were white or Black or Latino or Asian, we all face these kinds of challenges. And it ended up went from being something that could have been a negative to a real strong suit, a real positive that was coming up in polling. The last thing I'll mention quickly, one of the things we did, and you're seeing more campaigns do this now, we really segmented in our polling the electorate in lots of different ways. Traditionally it's Black and white and age and gender and part of the state. But also we were trying to understand around different values, different concerns, so that we could have a conversation with voters in a slightly different way, because again, we had a very unique candidate, a Black woman, running in Georgia for governor. And we know that, as you know, Melissa, executive leadership is particularly, like, we're seeing women elected more easily in legislative bodies, but that executive leadership is still really a challenge.
So I want to go to exactly this question of women in executive leadership. And since this is a college class, I went back and found something. So back in 2017, you were a fellow at Harvard, and you submitted to a kind of like student interview, I think at the time. I think student, and I thought this was just such a fascinating insight in 2017. So I'm thinking of this as like, this is right after the Clinton campaign.
Wounds were fresh.
Right. But you said something that really has me thinking. So Zach, if we have that video available of Karen talking about college women and leadership.
It's at the college level that a lot of women start to lose necessarily their interest in leadership, but start to not see themselves as leaders. So I think one of the things we need to do, and we do some of this already, is I think at the high school level, really encourage young women and encourage leadership, encourage them to take leadership roles. And then I think we have to make sure we follow through with that at the college level, given that that's where we know that something breaks down there.
All right, so here I've got a room full of students. Some are women, some are young women, some are young men. But where are you on that now? What are you seeing with young women relative to this notion of that particular kind of leadership?
Yeah, I think we're seeing more of it. And I'm so proud of this generation of students in college because they've grown up just in a different environment. And I think it's something, when I look at it, I look, from my mother's generation through our generation, and then just how we as women and Black women have had our own perception of who we are and what we can do. Part of the reason, and this is something I'm sure you're dealing with on your college campus, though I want to touch on, is part of it is that in college, particularly if you come from a small high school to a larger institution, there's just a lot of voices, right? And so much of it is believing in what it is you have to say and bring to the table, and not worrying about whether or not other people agree with you. I mean, to some degree, right? It's like, wait a second, I believe I've got something to say. And not letting yourself get drowned out, because as you know, it's easy to get drowned out and to kind of say, it's just not worth it. There's 10 other people. I don't have to worry about that. And I think we are seeing more women step up and say, no, hold on, I'm going to push back, and I'm going to have my voice heard. So I think it's improving a lot as we as women see ourselves differently and see more women. I mean, think about women running Fortune 500 companies, and we see more women. We have a Black woman who anchors the Sunday morning show, our friend Kristen Welker, and we've got on CNN, we have 2 women back-to-back Black women, and it's 3 women in our primetime lineup. Yeah. And I say that just to say, the more we see women as leaders and credible sources of information. And that may sound a little archaic, but very quick story. When I was at the DNC, at one point, Dianne Feinstein was actually chair of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, but they kept booking John McCain. And I kept saying, we have got to, because, no shame to John
I get
McCain,
it. I totally get how this happens. Right.
Right?
Yeah. Because he's the big booking. McCain's the big booking. Right. Yeah.
Yes. And I would have fight, and you and I dealt with this on our shows. Yeah. I would fight with the bookers and say, and I would have my team, and I would say, but she's the chair of the committee. She actually is more senior on that committee than he is right now. Yep. So from just a seniority perspective, and it took, and her team was obviously fighting as well. But that's what I mean when I say we have to see a woman sitting there as she is going to give you credible wise information that you can take to the bank. And that has been shifting too.
All right. Now we're coming towards our end, but before we get there, I do have a couple more student questions and I want to be sure that we get their voices in. So the next one is a very student question, but I think it's also a great one. This is coming from my student, Audric. So let's take a listen.
Hello, my name is Audric. I'm a senior doing political science as my major. And my question is, as a consultant in the political realm, what traits do you believe are the most important to be successful? Thank you.
Great question.
How do I get the gig and get successful at it?
That's right. I mean, a couple of things. Number one, experience in politics, whether it's in a campaign or working in a congressional office, a house, experience. And I also want us to remember politics is also, there's local politics. If you are working for, a local chapter of the NAACP or a woman's, if you're at the Miss, you're doing politics, right? Issues, that is part of politics, right? Politics was supposed to be about how do we make things happen. It doesn't feel like that these days, but so getting the experience and learning to understand what is the lay of the land. And I sort of think of it as like a map, right? Where you look at a map of the world and you know where the countries are. It's the same kind of thing. What is the political map in whatever environment it is that you choose to get into, so that you understand where are the nuances, where are the alliances, where are the touch points, where are the, where is their conflict? Because you want to be able to understand. That's part of how, when you're advising someone, you're helping them see those things. You're helping them see the bigger picture. And you're also hopefully are building relationships in different communities, so that, again, the advice and the guidance that you're giving to your candidate or whoever it is you're working for, you're helping give them advice, good strategic advice about how we get from A to B, whether that's in a campaign or moving a piece of legislation or building a project up. It's all about relationships. It's all about people. And, Vernon Jordan, esteemed Vernon Jordan, when I was young in politics, one of the pieces of advice he gave me was, remember that all the people on the way up are all the people on the way down. So it's really about personal relationships. It's really about how you treat people matters. Are you good for your word? Do you act with integrity? And is that the reputation that you bring to the table? Because that's how, some people go in and they say, I'm going to be cutthroat. I'm going to do some stuff that's, a little below the belt. That's fine if that's what you want your brand to be. But I think that's the other thing I always say to people: understand who you are and what you want your brand to be, and make sure you do your business, accordingly.
All right. Now, speaking of giving strategic advice, we've got a really great strategic question from my student, Jane.
Okay.
Hi, my name is James, and I'm a sophomore at Wake Forest University. My question is, how does the Democratic Party navigate a presumptive presidential nominee who's facing statistical unpopularity, in spite of the fact that Democratic Party policies are increasing in popularity? Thank you.
Yeah, if I knew the answer to that question, let me tell you what. Let me tell you, I would be in a big mansion.
Oh, you'd be making a lot more.
But here's, it's a really important question, because this is a truly unprecedented moment in so many ways. And I'll just touch very briefly. What is happening in the Middle East? We still don't know how that is going to continue to unfold, and how will that impact the presidential election, particularly if it ends up being a larger proxy war. That is a time when making the case that, hey, I want the guy with the experience and the steady hand, makes a big difference. Look, I think, to my mind, one of the most important things the Democratic Party has to do, and we're starting to see this, which I'm really glad for, more of the advertising and the work is people telling their own stories, less of the, we're going to tell you why you should vote for us, and instead having people who say, well, let me tell you how, the Inflation Reduction Act helped save my job, or let me tell you how, right? And I think because we want to see ourselves in this process, too oftentimes it is about, there's too much conversation about things that are not actually relevant to our day-to-day lives. So I think part of it is, how do we make these policies, how do we have the conversation in ways that it's clear to people how it affects them? One of the most brilliant comments, Senator Cory Booker makes this point. He says, child poverty, we now know, is a choice. It is not a moral failure. And how do we know that? Because under our COVID package, we reduced childhood poverty in half.
Yep.
So we know how to do it. We know it can be done.
Yep.
And if we choose not to continue to fund those programs, well, there you go.
Yep.
And I literally think we have to have very direct conversations about where the rubber hits the road. I will also say, I believe that democracy is going to be, especially when you look at, I'm not trying to be too political, but I do think that the former president is a real threat to democracy. And I think we have to remember, this is the first presidential election we will be running post an attempt to overthrow the last election. And there's so much we still are learning about that. So I think part of it is less about Joe Biden, the person, and more about what is at stake for all of us in this election. And obviously, reproductive rights being one of the most visceral, I think, for so many of us.
I will say the one little piece that maybe complicates it in ways that are particularly interesting for this class on Black women in politics is like sort of your point about, okay, if what we're seeing in Gaza continues, if this becomes more of a foreign policy election than we might have predicted 6 months ago, right? In whatever sense of ways that happens. And Joe Biden looks like the steady hand. But if you think Joe Biden, as an older person, may not serve the whole 4 terms, then the question is, how much does vice presidential, the candidacy of our current vice president matter, right? And how much work does the Democratic Party need to do now, right, to establish that a President Harris would also be capable of managing this crisis? Yeah.
1,000%. And, Perry Bacon, who so well, wrote a great piece about how, we can't be, he's kind of said the quiet part out loud, which is people have to not be afraid of a Black woman president. I mean, that's just what it is, right? And we're already seeing on the Republican side, former Ambassador Nikki Haley took it on first, but we're seeing others, weigh in. And in lots of different ways, they are, and this is, again, it is textbook what we see with Black female candidates. They're not saying, well, she's Black. They're saying, be afraid of a Vice President Harris. And the dog whistles are there. People know what that means. And the criticisms that she's incompetent, there are a lot of them that are very gendered attacks. There's a lot of research about the kinds of attacks we see against Black women and women of color. And look, I think there's no question that this election, this vice president is more consequential to this election than I think we've ever seen in our country. And they are doing, I've been really pleased to see the campaign acknowledging that. And I'll just say, I've been someone who early on has been saying, you can't do this the same way you've done it. We've done it with every other vice president, because it's not. And when people see it on television, they don't know what they're seeing because it's different, right? And I'll give you a great example. When people see her standing behind President Biden, as we saw Biden standing behind Obama, or Pence behind Trump, or Gore behind Clinton, people tend to say, well, what's she doing? They never ask that question with the men. Never, never, never.
Yeah. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And so we have to understand that we have to help people understand what they're seeing. And also she has brought unique things to her role, the role of the vice president. I can't tell you how many times I've said to reporters, Well, I mean, she brought in the heads of the Divine Nine. They didn't know what that was.
They were like, the what? The
The
who's?
The
Who's
9
divine?
people? There was 9 of them. And I said, do you
See,
know
that's
who
where
these
rumors started, and all of a sudden it's going to be like she was in some kind of religious cabal.
Right. But to say to people, do you understand who is in Black sororities and fraternities and who these people are in the culture, in the world? Why that matters? Why it matters to
Karen,
talk about Black maternal health.
I got to say, Karen, it is very hard for me to like put my pettiness aside enough to appreciate an AKA as vice president. It is I work on it regularly. I'm like, come on, Melissa, this is not the time. Because
Right.
we had Loretta Lynch, like the Deltas, we have been doing this for a moment. So
Oh,
having to
yeah.
just live with all those Howard AKAs for just months and months after the election, it was hard. I had to like mute all kinds of things on my Facebook. It was
Oh, I'm sure. But we have our fabulous Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Marcia Fudge, is a Delta. So,
of course, I know
moving it around.
we do our thing, but it was hard. Light skin AKA from Howard. It was hard. It was hard for me.
I know.
All right,
I know.
I have one last student question, which in
Great.
some ways is about this point of social media and about communication. So let's take a quick listen to it. This is Karina.
Hi, my name's Karina, and I'm a senior at Wake Forest University. And my question is, in what ways do you think social media has either helped or harmed young voters in being able to acknowledge a politician or administration's wins while being able to hold them accountable for their actions?
Great question. A couple things. Number one, one of the things that social media has done is to create a two-way relationship between each of us and the people we support and vote for. And you can tell and I still think on social media, authenticity matters. I mean, some people, yes, there are always the posts that are clearly done by somebody else. But I do think that's one of the things that it does do. It matters. People, I will say, unfortunately, I am not a fan of X, I'll be honest. And I think the power of what Twitter is a little bit diffuse now.
Yep.
But most importantly, it is a channel. It is a whole new channel in a way, both for politicians to get their message out and for people to make their voices heard. Think about the fact that every single one of us with our phone, we are citizen journalists.
Mhm.
Anywhere you go, you can record something, post something. So in terms of shaping conversations or, making your voices heard, I think that's a big piece of it. And from the perspective of campaigns, and as a communicator, it's been interesting to see how campaigns have really evolved and into really having to take social media as its own channel with its own norms about what you post and when you post and how you post. And to see candidates having to pay attention to it. Yeah. I remember in 2004, I don't know if you remember this, there was a New York Times Magazine did a front page story on bloggers. And it was like, oh, the blogs. Which I know. Right. And young people today are like, what are you talking about? What's that about? Is that on Snapchat? Is that on TikTok? But at the same time, I think it is important that young voters have really pushed the envelope to say, well, this is where we are. And that's the other thing. It's like, well, if I want to talk to you, I got to go where you are.
Yeah.
And it really has changed the way we do politics. Also, we learned this during the pandemic when we couldn't be face to face.
Yep.
We had to use social media as a way to communicate. I do think we have to, though, figure out how do we make sure that we have ways to verify information. It was obviously a big problem in 2016.
Yep.
So that we know what we're seeing, especially with AI.
Yep.
So that we know it's accurate. and it's reflects the truth.
Yeah, I haven't heard your dog bark this whole time, so I was a little worried that you might be a bot, but I'm
I'm
just
not.
going to assume you really are Karen.
She's sitting at my feet. She just looked up at me like, hey, what are you doing?
Karen, Finney, as always, you are so generous with your time, with your insights. Thank you again for taking the time for talking with and answering and responding to the questions of my students. We didn't get to every single one, but we got to a lot of them. I also want to think thanks again to the Ms. Foundation for Women. Again, their support is making all of this possible. Thanks to Zach, who is producing back there and throwing things up and making things happen. Thank you to all of the campus partners here at Wake Forest University, which includes the Department of Politics and International Affairs, the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, African American Studies Program, the Women's Center, and the Program for Character and Leadership. Remember, we still have 3 more conversations in the Sister of Citizens Conversation series. You are not going to want to miss any of them. And the next one is on Thursday, November 2nd. We're going to talk to Santana DeBerry. She is district attorney in Durham, North Carolina. And once again, the live stream will begin around 6:30-ish. That will be what's happening. All right, Karen, thank you again for taking the time with us. I so appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all those great questions, and always great to see you, Melissa.
It's so nice to see you too. Mwah.
To make sure that we keep making progress electing more women. Because we know that having progressive women at the tables where decisions are made, it's essential to continuing to make progress, to protecting our health care, ending our country's maternal mortality crisis, defending and securing our reproductive rights, and making our workplaces fairer and more family-friendly.